So, as I say, welcome to Prohibition Comes to Newmarket. So, the first step I think that we should do, first thing we should do is take a look at Newmarket in the early days. Now, the local historians and also the historians that deal with Canada give us quite a vivid picture of what our area was like before we became a village in 1857. And I guess we really liked our drink. This is a quote from, this is a quote that I picked up, I kind of liked, and this is talking about Main Street, Newmarket, which I think is kind of interesting. As you can see, we were a relatively small population, and we were surrounded by agrarian culture around us, farms everywhere. And I guess the men, and they specifically mentioned the men. It's interesting as we go through this, one will get the impression that women didn't drink. So I guess things have changed. But they mentioned specifically the men, and they say that the men used to come into town and load up with whiskey. They said that the downtown was full of shouting and singing. You used to have to apparently climb over drunk people who were in the gutter. And of course, because in that period we didn't have sidewalks, I would imagine that was quite the scene to see horses and carriages and people laid out face down in the mud. They made a point of talking about the fact that they would beat their horse because as they would leave the taverns, I guess they were pretty drunk. And I guess kind of in a mean mood, and they would head off home. And I can imagine what it must have been like, you know, the parade going out of Newmarket of horses and carriages with all these people quite liquored up. So basically, we had a drinking problem in Newmarket. I don't think there's any doubt about that because, you know, I found so many references to this being the case. So this sort of gives you a background, you know, from which we sort of approach this problem, I guess you'd say, and it gives us an idea of why people were starting to think we have to do something about this particular problem. I think we had more people come in, so I'm going to have to make this smaller for a second so I can see if we've got more people here that I haven't let in. Okay, we do. Good. Now back. Sorry about that. Okay, so as I mentioned, we were incorporated as a village in 1857, and the interesting thing is that council didn't meet until 1858, and the second petition presented to the new village council was presented by a Reverend Thomas Baker, and he wanted to address the problem of the availability of alcohol in Newmarket. He approached Newmarket Council and he said, you know, I have 74 signatures on my petition calling for council to do something about the drunkenness in Newmarket. And it's interesting, his petition, his original petition, what he wanted was he wanted council to take greater control on the granting of licenses to sell alcohol, and he also wanted the council also to come up with some way of controlling those people who, as I said, were laying drunk on the street, finding some way to control these people, making sure that we didn't have public drunkenness. Now, it's not as if this is the first time that this had come to people's or to the council's attention. Even before we became a village, people were, the business community, the churches, everybody was concerned about the excess drinking. So this is the first official petition that council had to deal with.
Richard?
Yes.
Are you showing any graphics or pictures? Because we can't see anything.
Oh, I'm looking at the I'm looking at my graphics. You can't.
I've just chatted with some people and they're not seeing it either.
Oh, okay. Well, it says here you're sharing and it's showing on people. I have no idea. Okay. Well, in that case, then.
Richard, are you sharing your screen, Richard?
Yes.
Okay, because it's not coming through. Okay.
Okay. Let's try this again. As I say, this is the first time, so
Yeah, that's all right.
Okay.
there's a very good possibility that I'm doing something wrong.
Gee, Bob, had I known, I would have put Niagara Falls behind me or something.
Well, I just figured it's appropriate to have the
It's perfect.
downtown background on me.
Okay, so this tells me, or it's telling me that you can see this. There's a picture of a guy emptying a barrel.
No.
Okay, well, this will have to be one of the things I put in my notes because I have really no idea why you can't see it. This is telling me you can. So I have no idea why you cannot see the picture. Okay, that's fine. So what we'll do is I'll just continue on with the audio, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to figure this out. As we go along, I will try and figure out what the problem is.
Excuse me, Richard. It's Herb here in Oakville. Are you I just see you're talking, you're giving a presentation, or are you sharing visuals as well?
Yes, this is what I was saying, is that I'm showing my PowerPoint presentation here. The corner tells me that all of the people who are on are viewing my screen. So that's why I don't understand.
Okay, I just see you talking. Are you also sharing a visual?
Yeah.
PowerPoint. Okay, that
Yeah.
I don't see. That I do not see. Sorry. It's okay. Thank you.
Yes, I am. Okay, let's try this a different way. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes, yes.
Success. Success.
Yes, yes, I see it. Thank you.
All right.
Victory.
Okay, so it's probably a good idea that we get an idea of this is, if you take a look here, this is a map of downtown Newmarket. We're always proud of Newmarket first, and back in, before Prohibition, official Prohibition started, this was our downtown area, and we were very proud to say that we had the largest collection of taverns and hotels in Ontario. We had more hotels and more taverns. So you had lots of places that you could go to have a pop. And that, of course, was a difficulty. Along with every hotel, and we had many, many hotels pre-Prohibition, but every hotel served alcohol. As well, you had taverns that served alcohol, and you also had merchants who would sell you bottles so you could take them home. The problem was people didn't take them home. Problem was, what happened was that people would, instead of taking them home, and they would go out onto the streets and drink them. This was, of course, to change once the town decided it would officially become dry. And we'll get to that in a second, what happened there. So, as I was saying, the first time that we had a petition for the council was in 1858, and all they were really calling for was a tightening of the licensing for alcohol, And also, they were calling for some sort of, I guess you'd say, control of the drunkenness that they were finding on Main Street. And at that time, it would appear, as I say, that they only had, 70-some people who signed the petition. At that time, we would have had about 250 people who lived in Newmarket proper. The next time they came along, what the council decided to do was it decided that it would, in fact, stop granting additional licenses to places to sell alcohol, and that it would, in fact, take a moratorium of 1 year to think about what they should do. So we had a delay of a year, supposedly, for council to decide what it wanted to do. What happened was that obviously council took much longer than a year, because in January of 1863, the province passed a new law, new act, nicknamed the Drunken Act. And in this act, what they did was that they decided that the issuing of tavern and licenses to sell alcohol would henceforth be taken away from the towns or the municipal councils, and would pass on to a provincially appointed body called the licensing committee, liquor licensing committee. And this is what happened. Now, obviously, the people of Newmarket weren't very happy, nor were the council, because what was happening here was that the decision was being taken away from the council and given to an outside body. And Newmarket was looking for a made-at-home solution. So what they decided to do is they decided that that they would come along and they would impose a license fee for anybody who wanted to sell alcohol. So that was, I guess, sort of a loophole in the Ontario Act, where if you were approved for a license, the town, or in that case the village, could charge you $200 in order to have a license. Now, the $200 doesn't sound like a lot of money, but back then $200 was a lot of money. Obviously, with the number of people drinking, as evidenced by what our ancestors tell us Main Street was like, probably those people who were selling alcohol could very easily come up with $200. So that really wasn't a deterrent. And things continued like this, over the course of the 60s and 70s. 1860s and 1870s, but what was changing was that the people who were members of the temperance movement were winning people over. They were very smart, because what they did was they decided that they would work on primarily the businessmen, those people who were religious people, and prominent citizens of Newmarket. That would be their first step. To do that, what they did was they first decided that they would take articles out in a local paper. Now, they lucked out in that Mr. Jackson, who was the editor and owner of the Newmarket Era, was a supporter of temperance. And so if you take a look at the early editions of the Era, it was sort of a one-sided coverage, I would say, because most of the coverage in the paper was about how horrible alcohol was and how we had to do something about it. Very few articles, supporting the sale of alcohol, supporting the taverns. So this was very influential in sort of setting people's minds. The second thing that they did was, because in Canada, as you probably know, there was a huge temperance movement taking place right across Canada, particularly in Ontario, and they had these people come as guest speakers. So you could go out of an evening to a presentation and listen to the fire and brimstone of these people, these guest lecturers who would come in and they would tell you all about how horrible alcohol was. As well, so the third group that they wanted to appeal to were the businessmen. So they went to the businessmen and they said, listen, who's going to come to Newmarket, particularly on Main Street, and visit if there's drunken people all over the place? So what this is actually doing, that's what they're saying to the business people, what this is actually doing is this is actually causing us to cease growth. We're not going to grow. You're not going to make money. People are going to stop coming to Newmarket. People are going to stop going out shopping because of the fact that that this is happening on Main Street. So we've got to do something about it. So gradually, the businessmen as well got on board. So you had, 3 groups there that got on board. And the final one, of course, were the churches. Now, the interesting thing is that the churches decided that alcohol was a gift from the devil, and that the churches, all religious people should be fighting the devil in every way they can. And so what they needed to do is they needed to come together and ban alcohol because alcohol was the cause of all problems. Have we heard that before? Our morality was going down. Our economy, they felt, was going down. They believed that families were not having the opportunity to see the husbands and breadwinners because they were off drinking, so they weren't coming home to be with their children and their wife. So the social atmosphere in Newmarket was suffering due to alcoholism. So this is their persuasion. Why they were very smart was because they were able to bring all of these groups together. They were able to bring all 4 groups together eventually into a unified force that would push council to do something and to come up with a local solution. Now, I might add at this point that Newmarket wasn't alone in this. All of which church decided that it would follow whatever Newmarket decided to do. As well, Aurora decided that they as well would join whatever Newmarket wanted to do. And so most of the meetings that took place, you had people from throughout Whitchurch and also from Aurora as well as Newmarket. Now, one of the important people who got behind the temperance movement was William Kane, who was our first mayor. It's interesting because his wife was on the board of directors of the temperance people. So, I'm a suspicious sort of guy, but I always wondered how much influence Mr. Kane's wife had on Mr. Kane, whether he really was anti-drinking or whether he was just doing what his wife told him. But irregardless, in 1879, William Kane brought his own petition to council on behalf of the group. And at this time, they had 203 signatures on their petition. And what they were asking for is that the town to somehow wrestle control of the granting of licenses, and that they somehow close those people who were seen to be, I guess you'd say, flouting the regulations. You would think that this would have moved council, but the difficulty was that hotels and taverns were bringing in a lot of money. And as you know, politicians are not really fond of stepping on people who are bringing in a lot of money, who are doing what they think is what we want to do, which is to be a very prosperous center. It's interesting to note that the 3 major players in Newmarket, the Kane Foundry, the Davis Tannery, and when it opened here, the Office Specialty, all came out officially in favor of prohibition. So that would influence a lot of people because a lot of people work for them. And from oral histories that I've recorded with people, they would say, or they told me that company memoranda would go through the workplace saying, you know, we would suggest that when and if a plebiscite comes up, that you vote in affirmative that you want to impose prohibition. So, you know, you had not only were the merchants on board, but they were also, you know, sort of twisting the arms of their the people that work for them. It wasn't really until 1865 that anything really started to happen. What happened was that the businessmen decided that they would go to council and they would appear. They were able to get the town to sort of evoke Clause 24 of the Liquor License Act, which allowed the town to control the amount of alcohol that was able to flow into the town. Now, just to give you an idea, because people always say, well, I wonder how much alcohol is coming into Newmarket. In 1882, we know that 600 barrels of alcohol were imported into Newmarket proper. So we're not talking about the suburbs, which in case would be anything the other side of Davis Drive or Mulock or Leslie or Young. So within that area, we had 600 barrels of alcohol coming in here per year. And given the population, that would be 2 barrels a day coming into Newmarket, and our population would have been, as I say, about 250, 260 people. That's a lot of alcohol. If we assume that women and children didn't drink, that's a lot of alcohol for the men of the village to be drinking. So that gives you an idea. You know, we had a lot of alcohol. So what the council decided to do is, this would be the first step. What they would do is they would limit the amount of alcohol that was allowed to be brought into the town. During the late 1800s, this was to continue. They would keep tweaking the law. They would try and cut down on the number of people who were allowed to drink outside. But so too the temperance people stepped up their efforts. Articles, they say, started to increase more frequently in the press. As I say, we had more guest speakers, we had more lectures going on about the problems of alcohol. Now that you can see the screen, you can see this is a article that showed up in the local paper, and as you can see in the little picture here, everything that could possibly happen to humanity was seen as being the fault of demon rum, and so effectively the people were being brainwashed. I mean, it'd be nice to say, you know, they're being won over to a great idea, but I think they were being brainwashed, because what happened was that eventually council decided that what it would do is it would hold a plebiscite. The plebiscite, the idea of the plebiscite was that they would ask the people what they wanted, which is exactly what the people who were involved in the temperance movement wanted. In 1892, we had our first plebiscite, and surprise, surprise, the majority of the people voted that they would like to have prohibition enacted here in Newmarket. And so it would be done in 3 steps. First step would be that you would only be able to buy alcohol in a established tavern. Any tavern that had shown to be a problem, not following the rules, would in fact be lose their license with no appeal. Second step was that they would outlaw the being able to drink if you were having a meal. So you couldn't drink if you were having a meal. You couldn't drink at private parties. You could not drink at hotels. So basically, you could go to a tavern and they were going to sort of hope that this would keep people from drinking. The other interesting idea that they had, which when you think about it is kind of insidious, is that they decided that if you wanted to buy alcohol, you needed to go to one central location. Maybe something like our current LCBO. The reason why this is kind of insidious is that you're talking about small populations, so everybody knows everybody. So the idea was that what they would do is they would put these temperance people outside the door of the establishment. So as you approach to get your alcohol, these people would, I guess, open up on you and tell you how morally corrupt you were to be doing this. As well, they would record that you went in and bought alcohol. And it was not uncommon that the Newmarket era would make mention of the fact that that Fred Smith, and I only picked that name because it came to my mind, but Fred Smith had been seen 4 times last week lining up for alcohol. So it's sort of the shame factor, I guess, of shaming you to stop buying alcohol. As I say, the idea was that the morality of Newmarket had to be saved, and the only way that you were going to save it was to get rid of drinking. So we became what I would call a puritanical village, carrying through to the time that we were a town. Now, what was happening in the rest of Canada and the rest of Ontario? Well, as I said, we officially went into Prohibition here in Ontario and in Canada during the First World War, and we came out of it in the 20s. So we weren't officially in Canada. We were not suffering for Prohibition for very long. However, one of the provisions that the Canadian government and the Ontario government passed was that it was up to local municipal councils to decide whether they wanted their town to remain dry, and ours did. We stayed dry. Now, it is true that over the years, people were able to whittle away a little bit on the law and try and find a way to get around it. But in fact, we were dry until 1957, when praise be to God, the liquor store and the beer store opened here in Newmarket. But it wasn't without a heck of a fight to get it. Now, I talked about the temperance people, and as yet I haven't given you their formal name. The temperance people locally was called the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and they were all powerful. They were in the belief that they could, in effect, change the morality of the town overnight if they were given the power to do so. They were well situated, as I say, within government, and well situated in the press and among the merchant class here in Newmarket. If you take a look at the board of directors, there were the who's who of Newmarket were sitting on the board of directors. So it's not much wonder that they had so much power. They decided that they would extend later on. They decided they would extend their influence. Once they were successful in convincing Newmarket to go dry, they decided, okay, why don't we get rid of tobacco? So they lobbied to try and get rid of tobacco. They wanted to get rid of gambling locally. And what makes me laugh, they wanted to set a dress code for women. What they wanted to do is they wanted to put a stop to this immorality that was being seen on the local streets, where the area between a woman's stockings where they ended and the dress ended was showing a little bit of flesh. We needed to get rid of that. So as you can see, they were a very ambitious group of people. But fortunately, they weren't successful in doing those things. But they had been very successful in getting rid of alcohol. Now, the joke, as far as I'm concerned, is that they had I'm going to call it a clubhouse, but I guess I should call it a meeting house. They had a meeting house on Main Street. And what happened was that that meeting house was moved over to Millard and became, I guess, what we now know as the Masonic Hall on Millard. The funny thing about it was that whenever the town had any type of event, celebration of the end of the war, returning military heroes, any type of event which they thought would be big, the location of the event would be at the Temperance Hall. Also, too, it's interesting that for those people who have read my article on the military camp and Newmarket during the Second World War, the Temperance Hall was the location of Club 14, which was the place where the public and the soldiers could get together to socialize. Now, again, most of what I tell you about that period comes from my oral history interviews, and that includes my own family. So let's talk a little bit about that. Newmarket was dying, and I'm sure people who read the article remember this, but Newmarket was dying during the mid to late 30s. The Depression had taken a great toll on our economy, local economy here. And so they decided that the way to help us out was to apply to the federal government to open up a basic training Army camp here in Newmarket, which they did. The great thing about it was that they brought in 3,500 new recruits every 6 weeks. Now, when you think about the fact that the population of Newmarket at that time was about the same, what we were in fact doing was we were doubling the population every 6 weeks by people that we were bringing in. Now, I'm sure most of you, whether you talk to your parents or grandparents, you know that people who were soldiers like to drink. I always thought it's interesting. These people came to a town which wasn't in fact dry. So how did that work out? Well, two things. First of all, on the Army camp did have a canteen where they could purchase alcohol. Now, obviously, for anybody who's ever served in the military or knows anybody who served in the military, this was a very tightly regulated disbursement of alcohol. So there was nobody going to get drunk on the Army camp. As well, the Army camp, and again, if you read my article, you'll know that Army camp had its very own Salvation Army church on the camp property. And the Salvation Army was very strongly temperance. So, all the time, if during the camp's operation, the Salvation Army would visit the canteen, and if they felt that it was too liberal, that there are too many people who were partaking of alcohol, then they would speak to the commandant or the commanders, and they would make appropriate changes. What happened to most of the soldiers, to be honest with you, is that they would catch the local bus or perhaps even the train and head to Toronto. Of course, Toronto was, during the Second World War, was wet. So they would head down and have a few pops in Toronto. They didn't even have to go all the way to Toronto. They could go to Richmond Hill, which was, of course, wet as well. So you had a lot of people who were leaving Newmarket from their military barracks and going down to get a drink. As well, Club 14 came along. Max Bogue came up with that idea, and what it was being held in the Temperance Hall. And the idea was that they would provide food, hot food, companionship in the way of being able to hobnob with the local population. And they officially would offer them coffee, tea, and soft drinks, and punch. No alcohol. Unofficially, and I get this from people who I interviewed and also from my own dear mother who volunteered there. She said it was not uncommon for people to bring bottles, and it was not uncommon for people to partake of alcohol at the Second World War get-togethers. What it was very strictly enforced was that it was in moderation. It was very low-key. It was they didn't want to appear to be flaunting any type of rules. And of course, because the military camp was bringing in an enormous amount of money to the town. In fact, in my article, I argue that it was the Army camp that actually saved Main Street. There would be no Main Street if it hadn't been for the coming of the military camp. They brought in new people who spent money on Main Street, who kept the merchants alive. So that's the reality. So they weren't going to fool with this. The other place that people commonly talk about is a place out in the corner of Yonge and Mulock called the Bucket of Blood. Great name for a place. And, often people will tell me, well, during the military times, this was a horrible place to go because, it was called the Bucket of Blood because people were constantly getting into fights. And this is the reason why it was called the Bucket of Blood, But in reality, in my investigations, I discovered that it wasn't until after the war that the, quote, Bucket of Blood became a pretty rowdy and not very nice place to visit. Before that, the military's belief was that if soldiers were going to an establishment, that the military needed to have a presence there. So I can tell you that during the time of the war, it didn't matter where the soldiers were getting together. The military was there making sure that the soldiers behaved. And I know soldiers are hard to keep an eye on, but they, in fact, did behave according to what I'm told. Even with the serving of alcohol in both locations, it was in moderation. And my mother, I remember telling me that the soldiers were real gentlemen who, when they were told that was enough, that was enough. There was no issue. They were being provided great music, lots of great activities. So, So the other interesting thing, I think, was that, and a lot of people didn't know this, for those people who grew up in Newmarket, they probably will remember, certainly after the turn of the century, you probably will remember that there was, sitting in front of the United Church, at that time it was a Methodist church, it would have been on the northwest corner of Park and Main, there was a fountain. Now, the interesting thing about the fountain was that the bottom level is for dogs and horses. The top level was for humans. And I am told that both, or all species, made good use of the fountain. It unfortunately was taken down in the 50s, but it was donated by the Women's Christian Temperance Union as a visible view for all in town. For the whole concept of temperance, but also I would submit to show their power. They built this. It was clearly defined that they had donated this to the town, why they had donated to this town, and to sort of keep in the town's memory the power of this organization. So. As I say, it was taken down in the 1950s, but many of you probably will remember its existence there at the corner of Main Park. I think the other interesting thing about this group, and I probably should have pointed it out earlier, was that, first of all, its name. Its name was kind of a misnomer. First of all, it was called the Women's, or Women's. And of course, its membership was not all women. I mean, we have, I guess probably from the movies or from cartoons, we have the idea of all these irate women marching, trying to stop men from drinking. But in reality, this organization had a huge number of men who belonged. And as I mentioned, politicians and local businessmen were members of this organization, along with the general public. So it certainly wasn't all women. Second of all, Christian. Yes, the churches were involved. Yes, the churches pushed for the establishment of this group, and certainly supported on the streets and from the pulpit the aims and desires of this organization. But this certainly was not a church-run or a church-dominated organization. Now, people say to me, well, you know, these people must have disappeared after Newmarket went wet in 1957. In fact, they existed as a power base here in Newmarket until 1970. In 1970, we have the records of their last meeting, which took place at York Manor, out there on Yonge Street, at which time they decided that they would disband. Their final statement, official statement, was that they believed that through their good work over all these years, they had saved Newmarket from being completely a despot organized location, and that their work was done. I often wonder if they were around today, what they would have to say about the legalization of marijuana. But then, as somebody who's interested in history, I'm always wondering how people from yesteryear would react to the things that are going on today. So in 1957, another plebiscite took place here in Newmarket. It was not an overwhelming vote. So I want you to keep that in mind. It was not an overwhelming vote, but enough people voted affirmative to lift prohibition, and Newmarket decided that it would, in fact, lift prohibition. Now, the pictures I just put up on the screen, I think it's kind of a cute one. This is what you would have seen on the streets of Newmarket. You also would have seen it at most public events in the area. As you can see, these people are well organized. You got all those lovely ladies sitting on the wagon, and they're asking for the public support in maintaining prohibition here in Newmarket. Because during that period of time that we were dry, there were many, many movements to try and strike down the law, particularly since most of the rest of the country was no longer dry. People here were going, why are we still dry? This is crazy. But 1957, we had a plebiscite with a very small majority of people voting for the lifting of prohibition. Now, what they wanted to do is they wanted to allow people to be able to go out and buy alcohol, be it hard liquor or be it beer. They didn't want people to be able to go out and have beer at their dinner, or to be able to go out and to a tavern and get drunk. So a lot of people aren't aware of the fact that we went through sort of a three-step plan, where in 1957, a new beer store opened up on Charles Street. That's the little street that goes between Davis Drive and Queen Street near the hospital. So a beer store opened up there, very first one for us. And the same year, we had the local liquor store open up on Eagle Street, across from the Pioneer Cemetery. As I say, on Eagle Street, it's on the south side, and I believe there's a music store there, and you can go and learn how to play an instrument. So that's what's currently there, but at that time, it was the liquor store. Those are the only two places in Newmarket that you could buy alcohol. So that was the first step. Second step was gradually. But what happened was that if you went out for a meal, and I have to underline the word meal. If you went out for a meal, you needed to, you could buy alcohol. You could buy a drink. It was completely within the establishment's control as to how much you could have. So, one place could say, I'm sorry, but you've got a bottle for 4 people. That's sufficient. You can't have another bottle. You could be limited to a glass. It didn't matter. But you were now able to get a drink with your meal. Now, you couldn't get around that by going in and buying an order of fish and chips, or maybe just chips, or buy an ice cream or something like that. It had to be an actual meal. And many of you probably remember the fact that how excited we were when we could get a drink with our meal. The next step, of course, was the reopening of bars. And of course, this would be the early 1960s. This was my time period going to high school. I don't know how any of us would have made it through high school if it hadn't been for places like the Compass and the Bonanza, the Carlton, that we could go. And of course, in Bradford, you could go to the Village Inn. So these places opened, and the interesting thing is that from what I remember back that period of time, I don't think we had learned a lesson. As soon as, of course, you allow people to go out and have a drink in public, they're going to go out and have a drink in public. And we had put Prohibition far behind us by the time I entered high school, let me tell you. Now, this picture, I just wanted to show you because people say, well, you know, it was always women who were against Prohibition. This picture would lead you to believe that it was only men who wanted to bring back alcohol. But of course, as you can see, this is taken in Toronto, but these are people who wanted to bring back beer. I assume they wanted to bring back any type of alcohol, but the sign just says beer, so maybe they figure if they could get beer back, then somehow they could get back alcohol. Now this slide is the new economy, and I took a picture of a bootlegger. This is the sort of the last story I'll tell you about Prohibition. Because you couldn't buy alcohol in Aurora and you couldn't buy it in Newmarket, of a Friday night, or most nights, but particularly Friday night and on the weekends, it was bumper to bumper. Hard to believe, but it was bumper to bumper going north to Bradford so that you could go to the Queen's Hotel in Bradford and buy alcohol because they weren't dry. You could get alcohol. The new economy comes out of the fact that, and most of you will say that you know nothing about this, but I think most of you do. Hall Landing and River Drive Park area was renowned for bootleggers. There are people for whom grandfather, father, and they made their living through the production of alcohol. This was sort of tolerated by the police. You know, yes, the police would shut them down. They'd be open by the end of the day. The police would come along and find them. Because they were making so much money, they could afford to pay the fines. And then finally, the police would put them in jail for a little while. But because it was a family enterprise, you know, if you put one person in jail, the kids and the wife would take over the operation. So they weren't shutting down the whole thing at all. So this is what, in my generation, in my family home, this is what Hall Landing and River Drive Park became known for, was for the bootleggers. And from what my grandfather told me, who I think was a real connoisseur of liquor, he always talked about the fact that there were so many great places you could go to buy alcohol. You could buy the good stuff. I don't know if the good stuff was high alcohol content. I really never had the nerve to ask him, but he had his regular places he would go. It was seen as being a regular occurrence. You would go, you would buy alcohol, you would bring it home, you would drink it in your home. This was the key. The police, of course, we weren't in a police state at that point, so you didn't have the police coming into your home to see if you were drinking. So as long as you drank at home or in somebody else's home or in a private function where somehow you could seal the doors to anybody other than the immediate group, you would go and buy alcohol and bring it home. And I'm sure many of you will remember bottles of alcohol, wines or spirits in the house that may not even have been labeled. And if they were labeled, and again, I was going to give names, but that's probably not fair. But if they were labeled, they were probably labeled with one of the prominent families who were involved with bootlegging here in the area. So Hall Landing and River Drive Park was the location of that particular economy. And of course, people always found a place to get alcohol. It didn't necessarily have to be from up there. The interesting thing, I think, is that the people who made their living doing this are the same people who are probably nowadays making their living selling other substances. These people always exist. No law is going to get rid of them. And anytime you have a substance that people want, and the law says you can't have it, there are going to be people making big bucks to get it. So we're sort of winding down what I want to talk to you about. This sort of gives you a capsule comment on or idea of a prohibition in Newmarket. There is a tie-in, I believe, to how things are currently here in Newmarket. Newmarket, I think, although there are a lot of people who will disagree with me, but Newmarket is very socially conservative. This is the reason why, when I started this discussion, I told you that when I was asked whether Newmarket would jump on the bandwagon for pot shops here locally, I said no, because that's not in the nature of Newmarket. I think history shows that it's not in the nature of Newmarket. Newmarket is a wait-and-see type of place, and I think that by knowing what happened back in the Prohibition era here in Newmarket, and the fact that we had Prohibition for so long, I think that sort of leads you to understand the nature of our community here in Newmarket. So if you've enjoyed this presentation, I would welcome you to come back on Wednesday when I will be doing the history of street names here in Newmarket. I probably will do only a couple of the wards at a time. My idea is that we will do it at 7 o'clock in the evening on Wednesday night, and try and keep to a schedule of twice a week. I'm hoping that this sort of thing catches on. I think it's a great way to kill an hour or so of your isolation time. I think it's a positive way to spend the time, and maybe people will be a little less bored. And as those people who know me and who have attended all my various functions throughout the town over the years will tell you, I'm dedicated to saving the stories, the history of this town. So an hour talking about this town is just perfect for me. Hopefully it is for you. Hopefully you will share the stories with your young people so that they will be able to share the stories to their children, and the stories will continue on. Along with this series that I'm doing, I also do a presentation, or I do articles on Newmarket Today. They come out every Saturday morning. I think we've done about 100 so far of all various topics. I do as well during the summertime, if we can ever get out of our basement. I do heritage walking tours, so you may want to join me on one of those. I'm on all of the social networks, so I'm sure you can find me. You just have to type in the History Hound, and you can find me almost anywhere. As you can see on the screen, this is my email, thehistoryhound@rogers.com. And lastly, these are my sources. I always like to talk about my sources because I don't know where I would be without my sources. I spend my life doing research, so these people mean a lot to me. Ethel Tuella and Robert Terrence Carter, better known as Terry Carter, and my uncle George Loosby are three people who influenced my interest in history. They continue to be a source of my research. I would probably say the primary source of my research. and all the things that I do. So I want to say thank you to them. I'm grateful, and it's their tradition that I'm trying to carry on through what I do as the History Hound. Obviously, the Newmarket era, I was able to access both council meeting records and also social comments, so articles about Prohibition in the era. And of course, most people know that you can access the era online. Easiest way is through the library. Go to the library and you can access it through the library. A book that I have in my library is The Temperance Movement in Canada by Peter Oliver. It's an excellent book, and it talks about all of Canada, but there's a small section that talks about Newmarket. And finally, my oral history interviews. That's another thing that I do, is these oral history interviews. So if you know anybody who you think we should save their story, let me know. It's free. I will go to them in most cases to film the interview with them. I use the information to do my presentations, to write my articles, and to do all the things that I do. I should probably mention, because this is something that somebody asked me, there is no charge for anything that I do. Everything I do is free, including the writing for the paper and the presentations. People do make donations, and those donations go to local charities. Generally, when we are raising money, we raise between $50 and $100 a week, which we give to local charities. We are fairly open-minded in the charities that we support, so I try to give a little bit of money to every charity so that we're helping out the community. And some of the money goes to pay for the oral history interviews, because I've had to buy equipment, and there is a cost to my doing that. And since I don't charge people to do it, nor do I charge people to see it, I do take a little bit of money out of the donations that are made to support that. So again, if you know anybody you think should be interviewed, or if you'd like to be interviewed, as I say, just drop me an email, and I'd be happy to make arrangements to go out with my equipment and capture their story online. So I thank you very much for listening to this. I will open up the mics if people have any comments or questions that they want to put forward. But I do thank you for joining us. At our peak, we had 14 people, which I think is pretty good. And hopefully every one out, we increase the number of people who watch live. But we are recording this, so I think that I will post this online so that people can see this at their leisure. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us. And now I will turn off the share. I will open up people's mics, hopefully.
Hey, Richard.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Richard. At that time, were the liquor stores government-run liquor stores?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, they were.
Were they what? Can you repeat?
Were they run by the government? Yes, they were.
Oh.
As were the beer stores. We didn't have the people who were able to open a franchise. At that point, we had the difficulty that government was involved in everything. That shouldn't surprise us. I don't know why it took so long for the government to get the idea that they should open the pot shops, because there's money to be made, obviously. Okay, I got one person I haven't been able to open their mic. Let's just see here. Okay, so are there any other questions while I try and figure out why this person's mic won't, I can't turn them on? Maybe David, who is on here, I can't open your mic from here, so maybe you can try and see if you can open it. There we are. We're good. Okay, oh, no, we're not. I thought we were, but we're not.
What? I really miss the liquor store on Eagle Street.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents used to call it the In and Out store.
Yeah.
because they had directions to go in and directions to go out. And I still recall from them that they told us children were not allowed in, and whether that's they just didn't want us in or not. And when you used to have a little pencil and you write down exactly what it was you wanted to buy.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. There was,
Mhm.
one thing I wanted to ask is, was there ever a time, like, I remember the hotels in Trenton where I grew up that years ago there was a men's entrance and then a couple's entrance. Like they divided into a men's section and then there was also a couple's section.
Yes, in fact, and that's an excellent comment. Yes, yes, we had that. We had that even into to my childhood.
Yeah,
I remember my father used to frequent the Queen's Hotel in Bradford, and I always remember my mother obviously was usually stuck babysitting for me, but when she wasn't, when we brought a third party and they were going to babysit, she had to go into a separate entrance. So I do remember that. That was true for most places. If you went to a dance, there was a girls and a boys entrance. If I remember correctly, certainly in public school, I went to King George and Stuart Scott. Boys and girls went in separate entrances. And I know that when you went to the dance, like the high school dance, if I remember correctly, there were two entrances as well.
The Newmarket High School did have a girls' entrance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I went to public school, it was like that too. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I don't know why that is, but again, as I go through this history and I do interviews, I mean, one of the great things about doing the oral history interviews is I can ask people why. You know, I'm lucky because I have this curiosity. Why did you do this? I mean, it seems like a very odd thing to do, and people usually tell me what the rationale was as they understood. I'll give you a perfect example of that has nothing to do with alcohol, but has to do with the voting. I was having a conversation I was recording my grandfather. My grandmother was sitting listening, and of course, smirking at my grandfather for enduring the interview. But the topic that I was asking about at that particular moment was suffrage. And my grandmother decided that she wanted to slip into the picture and she wanted to give her 2 cents. And she talked to me about suffrage in Newmarket. And this is a perfect example how great oral history is, because she said to me, she pulled back her hair and showed me a scar on her head. And she said, I got this marching for the vote. And she said, people have no idea the violence locally that women went through in order to get the vote. And I was just taken back. First of all, my grandmother was about 5'4". So I can't imagine, but boy, she must have been a tough bird, because she was out there and she got hit over the head with her own placard.
Wow.
For this. Second thing, and I always say this when I'm posting on the History Hound, which is my Facebook location group, I always say this. I wonder whether, and maybe, the women on here can tell me, I don't know whether women today appreciate what their grandmothers went through, their parents and grandparents went through to get the vote for women. When I talked to my grandmother, I just could not believe this. I couldn't believe it was the first time that I realized that she was not officially a person. Now, my grandmother owned real estate. She owned 18 properties in Newmarket at one time before she got the vote.
Wow.
And she laughed because she said everything had to be in my grandfather's name, because she could not buy real estate because she was not a person.
Mm.
And that just freaks me out.
Yeah.
But any other questions about prohibition? Nope.
I appreciate you doing this, Richard. It was very great.
Well, thank you for coming. I didn't know how many people would come. I tried to publicize this as much as I could. Hopefully we'll get more people next time. If you know anybody who you think would like to see one of these, please tell them that to come, because it'd be nice if we had lots of people. I can have the program that I've purchased will allow me to have up to 100 people. So it'd be nice to get up to the 100 people. That would be really good to get people talking. As we go along, I'll get better at doing this, which is because this is really the first time that I've done it online. I teach, back in the good old days when I actually had a job that paid. I used to teach business online, so I'm not completely lost in this. But teaching people and doing these things is very different. Teaching people, they paid me a great deal of money, and so they come. In most cases, they come, they stay, and they listen and they take notes, and that's about it. I don't really get feedback. But in this sort of thing, I want it to be fun, and I want people to have something to do, because life is not all doom and gloom. I mean, this is the I think it's the sad thing today, is the doom and gloom. And I think most people have no idea the rich history of Newmarket. When we do the street names, I think you'll find that there's a lot of new people that you're going to hear about who had streets named after them. Yes, we do have politicians who had their name attributed to streets. Some of those politicians are rightly so. Some of them you kind of wonder, but we will take a look at that. I think that's a good topic. Other topics that I've got planned to do is the entertainment scene in Newmarket from 1940 up to 1960, which will include, or 1965, I should say, which will include Teen Town, along with the theater scene and all the various other things. We had a very rich entertainment scene here in Newmarket. Hard to believe, but we did. So we'll probably do that. You have another question? No. Okay.
No, Richard, I do. Did you ever make a presentation for the industrial house?
Yes, I did. Okay. And that's another one we can do.
I missed that one, and I missed Miss Denny because of French Wednesday night. So
right.
Maybe if we go for it a Saturday or something.
Yeah, I can certainly do those. The industrial house is an interesting one because a lot of people, don't think about we actually having a place like Dickens wrote about here in Newmarket. And of course, most people know Miss Denny. I mean, Miss Denny, as you mentioned, she taught my grandmother, my uncles, my mother, and me. So she taught, if I remember correctly from the history that the York Region School Board has, she taught for 42 years.
Oh. Wow.
Now, a number of those years in the beginning were not official because they just came to her one day when she was 17 and said, how'd you like to teach a class? The funny thing, I always leave people with this, funny thing about her was, I did a oral history interview with her. And what really made me laugh was it wasn't until the 1950s that they figured out that she didn't have a teaching license.
Mm-hmm.
And when they came to her and said, well, you're going to have to go to teachers college, she said, I think I'll retire. You make me do this. She said, I want you to grandfather me, which they did. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Stay safe and keep the faith.
Lovely. Thank you, Richard.
Bye-bye.
Meeting.
It was great.